Spud Lily, Chapter 4. A phone rang somewhere in the distance, and each note seared like a bullet through Lilith's brain. When the deafening noise finally stopped, Choice's muffled voice rumbled through the air, but she couldn't make out the words. Trying to open her eyes was a mistake. The soft light of a lamp cut like a white-hot dagger into her right eye. The right side of her head throbbed with an unbearable ferocity, forcing her to clench them shut. After a few steadying breaths, she slowly inched her way up against the headboard. Waves of nauseating pain crashed down with each movement. Only once she was upright did she try opening her eyes again, prudently avoiding the direct glare. Confusion clouded her mind as she scanned the unfamiliar room. No windows, undecorated walls, and a closet across from the bed. One of the basement rooms? That made sense, at least. Not that her intellect was fully functional at the moment. 2 empty blood bags sat on the nightstand, sending her mind spinning. What the hell happened that required 2 units? Chance's voice suddenly boomed into clarity from behind the door. "I don't fucking care, Spencer! Get here now! You better have a damn good explanation!" The shouting rattled through her brain like ricocheting shrapnel, but she was determined not to pass out. Squeezing her eyes shut, she gritted her teeth as a dizzy spell nearly dragged her into unconsciousness. The door squeaked open, making her wince even with her eyes sealed against the flood of sunlight. "Sorry." His voice was so tender she couldn't be sure it was Chance until she cracked one eye open. The agony lessened a bit when he shut the door, enough for her to watch him sit on the edge of the bed. Carefully, he tilted her chin toward him, examining the right side of her head. Sympathy mixed with disgust pinched his face, which didn't lift her spirits. "How are you feeling?" She winced again as his fingers brushed over the fringes of a colossal knot. "Did someone hit me with a Mack truck? What happened?" Fingertips traveled lightly over her cheek before his hand fell to the bed. "God, Lily, you scared the crap out of me. Something hit you in the head damn hard and smashed its way through the door. By the time I got downstairs, you were out cold on the floor, bleeding like crazy." He released a heavy sigh, and his eyes fell, guilt weighing heavily on his shoulders. Out of pure instinct, she reached out and took his hand. "I'm okay, I think. This was my fault, not yours." A sudden stab of pain made her slump back against the headboard with her eyes closed. "So, 2 bags. That bad, huh?" Blood was everywhere. The haunting timbre of his voice sent a chill down her spine. "After the first bag, you still didn't wake up." "Hell, I didn't find a definitive pulse until the second bag." A moment of silence stretched out as she tried to wrap her mind around those words. "For a while I thought I was unemployed." This failed attempt at some much-needed levity was her life raft. A perfect excuse to avoid thinking about how close she came to dying. She started to laugh, but it hurt too much, so she settled for a smile. "Dad totally would have fired your ass." She chuckled half-heartedly as the vicious throbbing in her head made the world spin behind her eyelids. "Do you think Duncan has any Tylenol, morphine, horse tranquilizers, anything?" She peeked with her left eye when he didn't respond. A heart-rending vulnerability filled his eyes as they stared down at her hand, resting on his. Then, just like that, the impersonal facade clicked back in place. "Yeah, I'll go check." He rose from the bed and opened the door with an absent stare. "Chance." He stopped in the doorway and peeked back at her. "Are you okay?" The question surprised him for some reason. Sure, she was the one with the extensive head injury, but she never saw him so defeated in all these years. Anger, rage, fury, those she expected. But this... "I'll find something for the migraine." The empty, emotionless words were unexpected as he ignored her question entirely. "Oh, and Spencer is on his way here." "Spencer?" The pounding in her head made it difficult to organize her thoughts. A subject change so abrupt was like mental whiplash. Where was he? Last night Mariah called and asked him to chase down a lead. He's on his way back now, but hasn't heard from her since. Something else nagged at her, but she couldn't force her brain to work. The sharp torment was like a chainsaw trying to split her skull open. The phone. After several deep breaths, she tried to form the words. Why didn't he answer? He forgot his charger and the phone died while he was investigating. He didn't realize that Mariah was MIA until he picked up a new one and listened to her voicemails. He's somewhere in East Tennessee, so we have a few hours. She swung her legs off the bed and tried to stand, but a dizzy spell hit her like a gigantic wave. Her knees buckled, sending her towards the floor like a pile of bricks. Thankfully, he was there in a split second, strong arms wrapping around her waist, keeping her upright. "What the hell are you doing, Lily?" Before opening her eyes, she sucked in a few steadying breaths. Exasperation flooded his voice, but his face was full of worry. "I should investigate the last room. Has to be something here, something someone was looking for that's possibly still here." She was not eloquent with a head wound, and standing only made things worse. In a desperate attempt to make her mind function, she squeezed her eyes shut. When she opened them again, all she saw were his hazel-brown eyes flecked with green. "Lilith." He kept his voice slow and calm, as if talking to a suicide jumper. "You can't even stand. We can search the room later. Please, please, Lily, relax for now, okay?" The low rumble of his voice flowed over her skin like warm velvet as he pleaded with her. It must be the head injury. Carefully and a little reluctantly, he lowered her to the bed. Without another word, he disappeared through the door, leaving her to sink into the pillows. Laying down made all the difference. The pain settled to a moderate roar that pulled her into a drowsy state. He was right. She should rest for a bit. A few minutes to close her eyes, and then she could get back to work. Only a few minutes. When she woke again, her head was a million times better. A dull, throbbing ache still pulsed behind her right eye, but the world wasn't spinning anymore. She slowly sat up, moving her legs off the edge of the bed. Pulling herself to her feet, she stood still for a moment to be sure she wouldn't fall over. This time she kept her balance, which was a blessing since her bodyguard wasn't there to catch her. Lilith pulled the door open to the sunlit basement, a complete transformation from last night's house of horrors. "Lily, you're up." She yelped in surprise and stumbled backward into the doorframe as Chance sprang to his feet beside her. "Holy crap!" She bent over with her palms on her knees, gulping in air. Still shaking like a 90-year-old with Parkinson's, she stood and leaned against the wall. "You trying to give me a heart attack?" "No, I just got tired of standing in front of the door." She chuckled while trying to catch her breath. As he sighed heavily, a stern expression pulled his lips tight. "I'm trying to do my job." A mass of seething fury lit his eyes that she was confident had only one target: himself. "You need something to eat." He awkwardly declared the words and stormed off towards the stairs, leaving no room for refusal. "Not hungry, but thanks," she muttered to the empty air. What she really needed was water and a mirror. Time to assess the damage. The immense pool of drying blood stopped her dead in her tracks, unable to take her eyes off the brownish-red stain. It was a pint of blood, maybe more, if Chance hadn't reached her as fast as he did. Shaking off the thought, she resolutely marched into the bathroom. Once she faced the enormous mirror, her mouth fell open in absolute astonishment. The right side of her face was a mass of purples, greens, and sickly yellows. 4 butterfly band-aids caked in blood held together the edges of a nasty gash on her temple. Did Babe Ruth clock her with his bat while swinging for a home run? She couldn't even imagine how bad it was before the 2 units of blood and hours to recuperate. With tentative fingers, she palpated the colorful splotches and grimaced at the sharp, searing pain. Too bad they didn't heal instantly like movie vamps. Walking around in public would be problematic for a few days. Her father wouldn't be too happy if some hick cop threw his head of security in jail for domestic abuse. A startling thud resonated through the basement, and she cautiously peeked out to see Chance cradling his right hand. He stood in front of the broken door, jaw clenched painfully tight, as he stared daggers at a fist-sized dent. Before she could move, he reared back, slamming his fist into the door again while muttering under his breath. Quickly, she marched right up to him. "Whoa, Chance, stop!" A piercing glower made her pause for a moment. His whole face screamed, "Stay away," but she had to put a stop to this. "Better?" Her voice was surprisingly less judgmental than she thought it would be. With a sympathetic half-smile, she stepped forward and reached for his hand. "Leave me alone!" He jerked his hand away from her with a scowl, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Let me see." When he made no move to comply, she lifted her chin and held out her hand expectantly. His eyes shifted from hers to her outstretched palm and back again. Now is not the time to be stubborn. Standing still as stone, he stared mutely at the right side of her face. So you think breaking your hand will make us even? What happens if someone attacks us again, and you can't do anything because you had some guilt-fueled moment of self-mutilation? Hand, now! Once he begrudgingly gave in, she began assessing the bones and joints for fractures. I don't think anything's broken. He cringed and drew in a sharp breath as her fingers pressed against the base of his third metacarpal. First aid kit? Bathroom, he answered in a gruff whisper, not daring to meet her eyes. A few minutes later they were sitting on the bed, Lilith dabbing hydrogen peroxide to the cuts across his knuckles. Chance was still sullen, with his eyes focused intensely on some random spot of dark green carpet. 37, he whispered as she reached for the antibacterial ointment. After the lengthy quiet game, his voice almost startled her. I'm sorry? Her head tilted as she peered at him in complete confusion. Staring down at his hand, he continued. 37. I've saved Gregor's life 37 times in the last 6 years. When he paused, she stayed silent, knowing he needed to vent. She allowed him all the time he required while focusing her energy on smoothing ointment over the cuts and abrasions. I'm with you for 24 hours and can't even protect you once. Fuck, you almost died last night. Keeping people safe is my only job. The wrath seeped back into his voice, growing more forceful with each sentence. She dropped the Band-Aid and grabbed his chin firmly, pulling his face up to stare him in the eye. Listen to me. I gave you orders. I almost got myself killed. No! His wounded hand clenched, the scabs cracking open. My job is to determine the safety of the situation. I should never have let you come down here by yourself. Come on, you didn't fail. You saved my life. His temper and crippled sense of dutiful pride made her uncomfortable. What else was she supposed to say? His eyes narrowed like an intense laser locking in on her. She wanted to crawl to the other side of the bed and hide, but she refused to squirm out of pure stubbornness. If you fail at your job, more people die. What if you miss some pivotal clue that caused innocent people to suffer? Well, that certainly hit home. He perfectly summed up every investigator's worst fear. I fucked up last night. As much as she wanted to disagree with him, she would react the same way if the roles were reversed. Still, that didn't fix the immediate problem. He needed to snap out of his remorse-driven funk and focus. You think you're responsible, but you need to stop hogging all the blame. I see this going one of two ways. Either you guilt yourself into a coma, which will get me killed, or you'll become so overprotective that I'll have to kill you myself. Enough! You had your moment, now snap out of it. This, she gestured at the right side of her face, this will heal. So let's do something constructive and figure out what the hell is going on, okay? He stared at her slack-jawed. Tough love had its place. Finally, he blinked a few times and nodded. You're right. When did you become so brilliant? One by one, every emotion left his face until only his businesslike attitude remained. She went back to bandaging his hand, ignoring the rhetorical question. She was worried about him coming unhinged, but saying anything more would only make things worse. And for the record, she peered up at the sound of his voice and saw a glint in his eyes. I would kick your ass if you tried to kill me. Is that so? Arching an eyebrow, she pressed the Band-Aid down on his hand with a little extra enthusiasm. A stifled yelp escaped as he jumped and yanked his hand back. God, you're evil! His attempt to appear pissed off failed, and he only succeeded in grinning like a bobcat. After flipping him off, she slammed the first aid kit closed. Now that you punished the door and your fist, I want to check out Duncan's office. Call me paranoid, but I'd rather you be in the room. So you don't think I'll compromise the scene? Sounds like you're humoring me. I haven't seen much in the way of forensic evidence anyway. The blood trail isn't much, and now it's contaminated with... She hesitated, letting it sink in. With my blood. Rushing through the words was not only for her benefit, but his as well. We need to find out what Duncan's been working on, and I could use some help. Speaking of help, we should board up that door. I brought down some plywood I found in the shed. Wouldn't want the place overrun with possums. Or a raccoon. I hear people go after them with shotguns around here. The reference from their nightmare hotel finally coaxed a laugh out of him. After patching up the door, they stared wide-eyed at Duncan's office. The room was below average size, but he utilized every square inch with tall oak furniture. Antiquated sketches, old maps, and medieval rubbings covered any wall space left. Hundreds of books centering on the Dark Ages sat haphazardly on the shelves. Surrounding them were novels on history, alchemy, and even some on superstitions and legends. On the desk sat a newer collection on quantum physics, string theory, and herbal medicines, with random papers strewn everywhere. Organized chaos. At least she hoped the mess held some mysterious structure. Of course, her mystery assailant probably ransacked the place, or started to, before she so rudely interrupted. Once she slipped on her nitrile gloves, she flipped through the stack of papers on his desk. Well, he sure had diverse research habits. Chance shrugged and leaned against the door frame, allowing him to watch her and keep an eye on the outer room. Perhaps he just liked to read nonfiction. One of the bigger drawers in the desk contained a dozen or so notebooks. She pulled them out and scanned a few of the handwritten pages. No, he was researching something. These are full of notes. She stacked up the journals and gazed over at her aluminum case on the floor. Hey, can you grab a large bag out of my kit? They're in the bottom center. This? Frowning in confusion, he held up a folded brown paper bag. She quickly peeked up and nodded. He stepped into the room far enough to slip the bag on the table before hastily retreating to his guard post. Let me guess, you don't have enough funding, so you pick up supplies at Apple Tree supermarkets? The smug grin on his face typically made her flip him off. However, this was a hell of an improvement from his earlier attitude, and she was grateful for the return of conventional Chance, so she indulged him. Cute. To answer your question, no. The department issues these for most evidence collection. We only use plastic for air-sensitive things like bloody clothes or anything with a liquid sample. Plastic contaminates evidence, and the restricted air movement can be damaging as well. She didn't bother glancing up to gauge his reaction. Instead, she grabbed the brown paper bag and stuffed the notebooks inside. She knew this wasn't the mother lode her attacker was trying to find, but she was curious about her uncle's research. Interesting. Kudo points for genuinely sounding intrigued. Typically, when she nerded out about work, people gave a deer-in-headlights look and quickly changed the subject. So real life isn't like CSI, with everything in cool plastic bags sealed by fluorescent orange tape. Wow, I'm so disillusioned. She glanced up and chuckled at the bewilderment on his face. Oh, did I shatter your sense of reality? If you think that blows your mind, I'll have to tell you about the famous shocking a flatline myth sometime. Wait, what? The authentic surprise in his voice made her grin. Well, she uncovered an old tape recorder and about a dozen cassette tapes amid the chaos on the desk. After shoving them into the bag with the notebooks, she continued. When someone has no pulse and no heart rhythm, simply a flat line on the screen, what's the first thing they do besides CPR? And hand me the jar with white powder and the fluffy brush, please. After quickly rummaging around, he crossed the room to hand over the supplies. They use the paddles and shock them, so... She let him sit and ponder for a few seconds while dusting a light coat of powder over the deep oak. The screen shows the path of electricity in the heart. The paddles, which are now stickers, disrupt a bad electrical rhythm, hoping the heart will default back to a normal one. It cannot create electrical pathways. A flat line, asystole, is the complete absence of electricity in the heart muscle. A physical failure. Holy crap. Those lying Hollywood bastards. You can't shock a rhythm that doesn't exist. You can't jump-start a heart. Is that what you're telling me? Yep. Lilith grinned at his quick uptake, as well as his expression of absolute world-bending astonishment. The only option is to do CPR and give epinephrine, while trying to reverse the cause of physical failure. Man, I'm questioning everything right now. Deep in thought, he collapsed against the doorframe as she compared the few prints she found. All the same, not surprising, but also not helpful. Frustration began to nag at her, making the right side of her head hurt. There had to be something here. Assuming her attacker was also Duncan's, he had to be here for a reason. She needed to find it. If I was a secret bit of ultra-incriminating evidence, where would I hide? She mumbled to herself. More than an hour passed as she went through every nook and cranny of the expansive desk that dominated the room. In her gut, she knew something vital had to be here. Her uncle spent most of his time in this one room, that much was clear. So if a clue existed, this is where she'd find it. When she opened the last drawer, things didn't appear quite right, though she didn't understand why. In a desperate frenzy, she began pulling everything out, tossing it carelessly on the floor. Once empty, she inspected every inch, trying to work through the puzzle in her mind. What was bothering her? Then her eye caught on a dark smudge on the interior, right below the screws for the handle. She tilted forward to get a better look, and a jolt ran through her bones. Faintly burned into the wood was a crude arrow. She saw the design before. "Throw me the pocket knife." Chance crossed the room to hand it to her. "I can't believe you told me to throw a knife at you." After snatching the knife with a snort, she flipped it open and pried at the base along the corners. There had to be a false bottom, not only because the depth on the outside didn't match the interior, but also because she needed to find something. Besides, the crude arrow couldn't be a coincidence. The same one mysteriously showed up at her apartment. Someone wanted her to find this, someone who got an envelope to her in New York without using the post office. Finally, she caught the edge with the tips of her gloved fingers. A thrill of excitement ran through her as she popped it open with a small, splintering sound. She stopped pulling and slid her slender gloved hand between the layers, feeling her way around until her fingers brushed over a thin container. Bullseye. "Give me a hand." He rushed over and stared down inquisitively. "What do you need?" Brimming with excitement, she motioned toward her hand. "I need you to pull back on the piece of wood. Give me enough room to get this out." Telling him to put gloves on was pointless. There was no way her assailant would take the time to put everything back in place with meticulous care, which meant they hadn't found it. "I could pull the whole thing out for you." He started forward, grabbing it for the edge. "No, don't break it. I want to leave everything intact." And phrasing. A Cheshire cat grin curled his lips as he choked on a laugh. The thrill of finding a clue was a little intoxicating. "Besides, if whatever's under here is as important as I think it is, I don't want anyone to know we have it. Maybe no one else would ever think to search under here, but I guarantee if anything is broken, people will realize something is missing. Until we understand what's going on, I don't want to make myself a bigger target." He nodded and deftly pulled back on the panel with careful fingers. Thankfully, the thin prefab sheet bent and didn't snap. As she pulled the box out, her glove rolled down and the back of her hand scraped sharply against the rough edge. She drew in a hissing breath and bit her lip as the treasure came free. Slowly, he lowered the piece back in place and tapped around the edges. Pressing the hem of her t-shirt against her hand stopped the bleeding quickly. Thankfully, the abrasions were superficial. When she inspected the drawer, it appeared almost perfect. A few little dings along the side where she used the pocket knife were the only blemishes, but they wouldn't stand out. "Can you throw all that stuff back in for me?" He stared at her hand while grabbing an armful of baubles off the floor. "You okay?" "Just a few scratches." With a satisfied nod, he began tossing the eclectic objects back where they belonged. Crystal vials, antique buttons, old Coca-Cola tins, a china doll stained beyond recognition, a leather pouch of dice, 4 pairs of scissors, a few rusty hand tools, and the ever-popular Ziploc bag of random batteries. What the hell's with all this crap? This is like a mini edition of Hoarders. To conceal this, the 6-inch square container was a faded motley of colors, so chipped and scratched that she couldn't make out the design. When looking for something important, you check places people will remember. No one recalls what they threw in the junk drawer. Plus, the clatter from all the bottles and whatnot would cover the sound. What do you mean by cover the sound? His frown deepened while throwing the last few things inside. This was in a space much larger than needed, with nothing to keep it from sliding around when someone opened or closed the drawer. If you opened something filled with papers and heard a metallic clink, you'd know something was up, right? He smiled and leaned against the desk, folding his arms over his chest. His body posture alone said volumes. Impressed but defensive. He was holding on to something, a secret of some sort. She noticed it several times before, but she didn't have time to dig. In fact, she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to. "So what's in the thing?" He lifted his chin toward the box in her hand. "Only one way to find out." She flashed him a smile and pried at the tin box's rim. When the lid finally popped open, a musty smell filled the air. A myriad of small items lay inside, including tiny portrait paintings and several things wrapped in linen. Underneath those, she found a handful of parchment, some blank and some covered in ancient scrolling letters. She reached for the first covered item with delicate fingers, concentrating hard on being careful. The sudden thunder of a screaming voice made her jump in the chair, and she almost dropped the box. "Lilith, Chance, where are you?" Spencer's voice echoed down the stairs as she scrambled to keep all the contents inside. "Office!" Chance yelled back. Leaping to her feet, she grabbed his shoulder with a stern resolve. "I want to keep this to ourselves until we know more, okay?" The gravity of her tone weighed down on him until he met her stare in a moment of genuine understanding. "I don't want to show her hand yet." She trusted Spencer. He was blood, but she didn't know what this thing was or why Duncan went to such extremes to hide it. Perhaps it had nothing to do with his disappearance. What if he were simply hiding stuff from his kids, things he'd rather they not see? A smile stretched his lips as he nodded in agreement. "Let me guess. Texas Hold'em?" She tucked the thin box into the waist of her jeans and tugged down her blood-stained t-shirt. The dried blood sticking to her skin made the task far more difficult. "Do you study a smart-ass textbook or something?" With a laugh, she shoved at his shoulder. "I prefer spades, anyway." "Can't handle a real game of poker." She quirked one eyebrow at him with a playful, indignant snort. "Phrasing. So if money isn't involved, it's not real. You're on for a game. Now I need a shower and a change of clothes before this shirt permanently adheres to my skin. Do you want me to grab your suitcase?" His grin melted into a smile that was soft and genuine. "Thank you, but I can manage. I need to stow my case anyway. You might be able to find something out. I spent a lot of time with Mariah over the summers, but I was never close with Spencer." "Well, now that hurts my feelings." Spencer's southern drawl was unmistakable. His voice would have been something girls dreamed about, if it were a couple of octaves lower. She blinked, astounded. If passing him on the street, she wouldn't recognize him with his disheveled, sandy brown hair, rumpled clothing, and bloodshot eyes. Tremors coursed through him, and a frenzied panic pulled at the corners of his mouth. He was a lot thinner than she remembered, tall and lean, his clothes hanging off him. The painfully forced smile on his face made goosebumps fly over her flesh. He looked like a meth head on the verge of a breakdown. End of chapter 4.